Good morning, everyone. And before we get started, I want to thank Chatham House for the invitation to take part in this meeting and to present in front of you. And knowing that you have excellent interpreters, I will speak in Spanish so that the Spanish speakers and our Latin American colleagues understand me. I also want to thank the people, the interpreters, because they're doing a great job. In the Congo Basin, there's only 200 million, approximately 200 million of hectares. And these, as you well know, represent the second world tropical humid forest basin in the world, and is considered to represent 50% of biodiversity. In these 200 million of hectares, 45 million are being harvested, 9 million are under certified, FSC certified, or other certification programs of exploitation, and a little over 5 million hectares have FSC certification. Some also benefit from a double certification, thanks to PFC, that in the Congo Basin is called PAFC. So today we're going to try to look at how these companies are working, or at least the companies that are part of the ATIBT group. We know that there's a huge difference between economic operators or in the Congo Basin, but we will look specifically at those who are doing things right or very well, that we think should be an example to follow. I'm sorry, I need my glasses because I cannot read without them. So, as part of what I'm going to say, what I'll try is to go as far as possible in my way of thinking, taking into account that the the private sector has an important role to play in the next few years. There has been a time when the private sector maybe hasn't been well received, and this was well deserved in some cases. But I think in the current times, in light of climate change, we need to bring the private sector forward, and we need to find ways of getting the best agreements with them so that this private sector, that is a key actor in terms of the management of tropical forests, plays an important role, and I consider their role is decisive. So, above anything, this sector is evolving, but not always in a positive way. No, I'm not talking about the private sector, I'm talking about, in general way, the tropical timber sector in the Congo Basin. Above all, we have many political changes. The oil crisis from 2015 has left the Central African states without resources that came from oil. And while it's true that oil is not the main source of employment in these countries, this is the forest sector, the first source of employment after the state. The oil sector has been the most profitable one, and the one that has allowed for some governments to reach quotas of self-funding at the highest quotas. Today, the situation has changed dramatically, and the forest sector is suffering from a lack of medium in the main countries around the Congo Basin. On the second point here, there's a huge pressure with regards to the economic actors, the Asian actors in these forests. Today, in Gabon, 75% of the forests are under concessions that are in Asian hands. A little over 50% in Congo, Brazzaville, there are Asian actors. A little under 50% in Cameroon are Asian stakeholders. Today, over half of the tropical timber production in the Congo Basin goes to China. So in this way, we have to bear this in mind. The economic model of the certified companies in this context is today severely impacted. They seem weak. And this is one of the main issues that we consider in terms of forest management and in terms of our association. The best proof of this, of the certified forest sector, has been the end of the Bouget company in Cameroon, the Wismar company also in Cameroon, due to other elements with the armed conflict. But we cannot hide from the fact that other forestry companies and certified forest companies are not living their best days elsewhere in the world. Each company, each sector has its own agreement, its own pacts with their governments, and this is something that is impossible to manage in the future. Another problem that we're facing is that the forest sector doesn't have a political priority, and to put an end to these issues at the same time with the image that we have in the consumer countries of the tropical timber. The tropical timber has a bad image for us. Also, the Asiatic and Chinese actors in the Congo Basin work when the lack a level playing field, and with regards to certified companies or with companies when compared to companies that are abiding by the law. So, how does the private sector contribute to an improvement? We have talked for a long time about the VPAs. I would here like to highlight something, and is the private certification, and specifically FSC certification that covers over 5 million hectares. Sometimes I'm surprised when I presented several meetings of how little value and how little known the certification of tropical forest is. Maybe because the certifying organisms do not promote, do not make public their way of working or how these forest companies work. Or maybe they fear how to highlight this process that is under strict criticism from other actors. Today we would like to shed a light on this certified sector that deserves all this attention. We talk about FSC and over 5 million hectares. Last year in Gabon, it was certified a company with a double certification, FSC and PAFC. And within the next 2 years, we think that a PAFC standard for the Congo Basin should be developed. Hablamos del FSC, que son más de 5 millones de hectáreas. El año pasado se certificó en Gabón. So, with this in mind, I believe that the situation of the Asian companies, or better said, is the Chinese companies, deserves some attention. I've said it before, and they represent over 50% of tropical timbers produced in Central Africa go to China. And this is linked to a cultural interest that dates from a long time ago. They need tropical timbers for a series of things. Last week, I held a meeting with someone, a Chinese guy from a company in Paris, and he was saying that maybe this won't be as strong in the next few years, that Chinese consumers now have more economic power and they still want some tropical timber, but there has been a change from the side of the Chinese consumers, and they're starting to show preference towards other lighter timbers. And today, the Chinese consumers are seem to be going back to preferring lighter timber. Today, the consumption in China is 20 million of cubic meters a year, of which around 5 million come from Central Africa. The Chinese companies operating in Central Africa are very competent, they're efficient, and they're very inventive. They are a lot quicker than the rest of the companies or traditional companies in the sector. And they're more pragmatic as well in terms of the trade of different timbers of different qualities. The European trade is focused just on exceptional quality. We want la crème de la crème, the best of the best. And in the end, we're contributing to bad harvesting or bad practices with regards to tropical timber in tropical countries. And we have to start changing our consumption habits and to accept, like we do with other timbers, we need to accept that tropical timber sometimes is not perfect. And then in this way, we will avoid these two sides of the coin, because it doesn't do anything for us to have two sides. Oh, and when talking about boards of timber, it doesn't really matter for us if one side of the board is not perfect, because we won't look at both sides of it. So these operators are very innovative. But this is not a problem. This is quality, this is a plus. But this leads to a problem, and unfortunately, that is that they not always respect the legality or respect the sustainable management. These are stakeholders that started appearing in Africa exactly 22 years ago. I remember very well when the first 6 Chinese companies that were operating in Malaysia in 1995, and they had to start looking for other sources of timber to ensure they had access to this in the long term, and they decided to invest in forest concessions in Central Africa. These forest companies are well established with different solutions, but we could say that they haven't lived the whole process that the more traditional companies have gone through from over 20, 25 and 30 years ago to learn about sustainable management, to learn about how the management plans work, and to leave the whole process of certification. That we should remember, the first certified companies in Africa were CIB in Congo and another one in Cameroon. I can't remember which one started first. They have been certified for 13 or 14 years now. So the Chinese actors have come to Africa. They have had to learn how to work in African countries, how to work with the African workers, and the legality problem and the issue around sustainable management, they have left it aside, because in the first place, this wasn't the key priority. And then also, I don't know if they really understood the culture behind these processes. These Chinese actors often are supported by the Chinese government, and we don't really know well how and by which methods, how the Chinese government is supporting them. The Chinese embassies in Africa are very hard to reach, and then there's some kind of official support towards state-owned companies. But we don't really know yet how this support is played out. But we could say that this is something that we should start trying to understand. Luc Matteau spoke about the Kebasingo scandal, and this was a huge scandal and disastrous. But unfortunately, I think this is the tip of the iceberg of what's happening on a daily basis. As we have seen, this scandal was uncovered, but I don't know how many more go uncovered. However, everything has a positive side. This scandal, I believe, should allow for us to now establish mechanisms and a process of dialogue with these Chinese companies that probably will be something positive. The best symptom that shows us that something is happening is that a year and a half in China, the global supply chain, an initiative comprising 12 Chinese companies, high-level Chinese companies, that wanted to change the image of the Chinese companies in the international market. And at the same time, as this initiative was taken off, another IWPA decided to organize an encounter, a meeting in China, and we didn't know who to speak to. We didn't know whether we had to find associations, private associations, or independent companies. And we were lucky enough to having organized our meeting with this new supply chain. And now we're going through a process trying to understand what's happening in China, but we have to be careful and not to be too optimistic here, because sometimes by speaking to the Chinese organizations, they themselves don't understand what's happening in their country. We all know that the President Xi Jinping has said that the ecological civilization, he's made a great declaration with this regard, but when we talk to the person responsible of this global green supply chain, we know that the situation lacks stability because it doesn't belong to the private sector or the public sector. It's not well defined, the status of this. But then if you're being told that you have to trust the future, your president has talked about the ecological civilization, but then there are 14 different commissions, and anything can happen as part of this process. So the Chinese administration is extremely complex. There are many ministries that are taking part in this process, and part of our will is to try to understand what is happening, and also to help the Chinese actors that have the will to work towards sustainable development, for them to be clear with regards to the future they hope to see for the wood sector in tropical countries. We're not in a rush. We're not looking at it as an urgent thing. We're looking at it in the long term. We know it's a long process, but it's important to have a clear position on these issues.
Estamos de acuerdo que es un proceso muy largo, pero creemos importante que haya posicionamiento.
So, moving away from the relationship with these Chinese actors that we consider is key, in a more general way, looking at the future of our sector, what we have to do is give value to the tropical forest. Sometimes the private sector, as we said before, is presented as the bad guy, the black sheep in the sector, and then all the problems are their fault. But if we don't have a forest economy in tropical countries, then there's no raison d'être for the countries to keep a tropical forest if this does not represent a source of resources. So then they will create natural parks, conservation, but if the private sector does not exist, does not participate, I can tell you that the African countries need development, they need access to food, they need resources, and therefore there is a high risk here for conversion of many areas to agro-industry and agro-industrial practices. So, to fight against deforestation and land conversion, then we need a respectful forest sector. and a profitable one as well. I know that there have been many criticisms, and also recently these have been aimed at certification and the certification schemes. The problem here is, well, what is the counter proposal? If we get rid of these, what will we replace these certification processes with? These certification processes, of course, they could be improved. They are not perfect, because perfection is not, does not exist in this world. But we have to work with them. We need to make sure that we complete the processes. We have to make sure that we take part and ensure that these processes are stronger, are more solid every day. For me, it's a pity when a certified company, just by the fact that it's certified, then finds itself on the light of communication or negative communication. But I'll say it again, these companies are not always perfect, but many times the commitment, the certification commitment is such that sometimes leads to problems because we have been too optimistic or because it's very difficult to reach perfection. But this is a process. The certified companies are a little like the story of this man. He goes to a pub in London at night and he's a little tipsy. And then he loses his car keys, and then he starts looking for them on the street light, and he cannot find them. And then someone comes by and says, "Excuse me, sir, what are you looking for?" "Well, my car keys." "But have you lost them here?" "No, but there's light here." No, and the story for the certified forest companies is the same, that all the light is above them. And obviously, they are under the watchful eye of organizations, of the NGOs, the conservation, civil society. And sometimes, I'm not saying that everything they're doing is right, but sometimes we're trying to find imperfections where there aren't any. So, I'll move on. Let's see, I don't know where I am now. I was talking about improving the certification process. We need to diversify as far as possible the certification processes. It's better to have two tools than just one. The only FSC that is completely respectable is good to complete it or complement it with a PAFC in Canada. The 17 main forest companies in Canada, and 16 of these have double certification. And I think, well, this must be due to something, right? There is something that, well, here is something key. The certified forest companies in Petit Comité, this is here talking to you guys, they sometimes act as NGOs. They carry out a lot of work that belongs to NGOs in terms of social plans, in terms of hiring doctors, they organize workshops, they help in building good quality houses. In education, they help the state in remote areas with regards to the environment. They hire experts or eco-wardens, and they fight against poaching. And this is a resource, the resource of selling certified timber. That's the only resource they have. And by selling certified timber, this allows them to do great things. And this is the situation that takes them to the edge of all the possibilities in terms of the finance. So we therefore have to start considering other options to complement the solution for the financing of these companies. In a more general way, and I will be finishing with this, we need to start acting in Central Africa, not just us for the private sector. We need to act on the ground. We have to work with the government, and this is an extremely difficult and complex process to split the land in a more equal or balanced way between agro-industry, logging operations. Like, the population is growing. From now till the year 2050, the population will double. They will carry on needing to export, whether it's rubber, palm oil, cocoa. So a country such as Gabon, we have 86% of the country is a dense, moist forest. So we cannot kid ourselves. Gabon won't be able to keep this 86%. But we have to avoid this mosaic that we suddenly have the development being done in a more indiscriminate way. So we need management plans in a more general way. We need to work with land tenure. There won't be plantations or forest plantations in Central Africa if we do not have... Right, I will be finishing. If we do not have security in terms of investment, so we need to work on investment, we need to work on taxing, we need to work also on logistics, because this is a mess at the moment, not just in Indonesia, because of the amount of islands that you have, but also with regards to the complex ports and roads that we have in Central Africa. So there were many more things that I had to say, but I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry for keeping you to time there, but we did start a little late, so we can keep going through. But there will be a chance to ask lots of questions very shortly. But before we do, I'd like to bring on our final speaker, again, I believe in Spanish, Norma Rodriguez, from the Agroforestry Association in Honduras, to talk about your experiences there in engaging the private sector in Honduras. So, Norma, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning to you all. It's Norma Rodriguez speaking. They have asked me to talk a little bit about the difficulties that we find in the cooperatives, because we are part of the private sector in the trade associations, because the property is private property, but there's several owners. It's a group of people who form part of these small companies, and we require the assistance of the previous speaker. I see lots of opportunities that as private owners we could take advantage of. We also have some concerns with regards to how to be able to access these FLEGT licenses due to law enforcement and the compliance that we have to support. How could we obtain the assistance in order to give us the capacity and to develop or strengthen these capacities that we may already have in our communities, in our small companies? In our cooperatives, we are a group of people that get together in order to improve our life conditions. But in order to do this, we have to improve the production conditions, but also knowledge of how to comply with the laws in the country. Sometimes the requirements are so many that information does not reach our communities. We currently have compliance of payment of taxes to the government with TLAs, and our communities don't have enough knowledge in order to find out what is the process that they have to fulfill in order to make these payments. So we need this assistance. We need to bring this knowledge to our communities because we do want to comply. If we have this knowledge, we will be able to comply, and we will also be able to access these flagged licenses. We will be able to access newer and better markets in order to provide better opportunities to the men and women of our small companies. And so I would like to say to the people who have spoken before me that they can hopefully help us help these private trade companies in order to be able to take advantage of this new world, our new market for our producers. We are a country rich in natural resources. We want to be able to harvest them in a sustainable way, bring in knowledge and capacity to our people so that we can diversify the products. We have women that produce furniture, cabinet makers, but we also need capacity to improve the capacity to obtain a better finishing and for us to be able to comply with the requirements of a more exclusive market that can value the labor, the work that our men and women do in transforming timber. And for this reason, we need the support of many of you, and I hope that you are interested in supporting us. Gracias.
Would you like to join? Could I just invite all of our speakers back up, and Norma to take a seat up here, to come back up the front. I'll get out of the way so that we've got enough chairs. We had a good range of experiences and a good range of sort of global experiences in trying to engage the private sector in policy change and the change of business practice on the ground. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions for, particularly for Andrew and Ruth and Benoit. And it was based on a comment that Norma just made, saying that there's a big difficulty with low law enforcement in countries, and that there is so much information about policy change that it's hard to reach and it's hard to communicate out to a lot of rural areas. So, starting with Andrew, how important then is the role, say, of a trade association within those countries in terms of getting trust and getting communication?
I think what we were finding was the range of associations, sort of the representative sample, as it were, that we talk to, already have quite a wide and deep reach into really broad membership. But how well, and that membership sort of knows and acknowledges the association, and there's a level of trust. So that's interesting as a place to start. At the same time, the capacity of association seems to vary quite wildly. So there's your own, which is a fairly professional organization that engages. Others struggle. So I think the concept of a trusted business support vehicle is a good one, but there needs to be more assistance to get them up to the level that they can be useful.
And Ruth, would you say the same thing?
Yes, and just to complement, for groups like us, it's very difficult to reach individual, companies, and so working through associations is the best way to reach out to these individual companies. Okay,
just to stretch that out as well, then, you talked, particularly in your presentation, Ruth, about the links through to the IWPA, the International Wood Products Association in the USA. How does that help with that sort of dialogue with the importers there? I guess that's a key market for the countries in your region, so.
Yes, but I think it's so it works very well in the U.S. Where they provide this. The training is a service that they provide to their members. I think, and we want to replicate that exercise, but working with in-country partners. We prefer to work with people that they trust in their countries rather than a foreign association, and there are limitations with language as well.
Okay. I'm going to open up with questions across the floor. So if we could just take 3 at a time, and I'm going to start with John over here. I think the microphone is coming.
Good morning, John Honteley. I work for FSC, and my questions have to do with certification, and I have questions to the 3 first speakers. Andrew, you did not mention the cost and complexity of certification as one of the top 7 common business challenges, but my question is that at all playing a role in your work? To Ruth, also, I understand you're working on legality, but I can imagine that certification, in particular for SMEs group certification, could be an issue that is being raised. Is that part of your program, or is it coming up when you are doing these trainings? And Benoit, well, I agree with most of what you said about certification, but I didn't really understand why you are promoting double certification. And I mean, you mentioned the Congo Basin and Canada as 2 examples where we see indeed a very big increase of double certification, but it is mainly in one direction. It is FSC certified areas that are becoming double certified, and I don't understand exactly what the advantages are. We see more the disadvantages because they are, in our view, very much stimulated by the fact that FSC is introducing intact forest landscape requirements, FPIC requirements in Canada and so on, and that is apparently seen as an additional burden for companies and that they are looking for a way out. So, in fact, this can have the impact that it's put FSC on pressure to not do these things. So, why do you see this as an advantage?
Okay, I'm going to move on. There was another question from a gentleman just here in the middle.
Gracias.
Thank you. I'm Mario Martinez. I'm the Minister of the Forest Conservation Minister in Honduras. First a comment and then a question. Based on the presentations, in the first 2 presentations, I would say that the training context requires an innovation, even some level of demand. I have seen in the last couple of years some training courses which, in inverted commas, are a bit weak. Their agendas are not very demanding and the products are not very tangible. I think the forest sector includes subjects that would require training with tangible products. And in that context of generating capacity, I think you also need to go for generational change. I think in Latin America, I've seen for 10 years the same actors, but I have not seen young people who could generate innovation and change in the sector. And also, the question is for Benoit. We talk about it at the coffee, and he mentioned it tacitly with regards to market trends in the Asian sector, and talking about China in particular. I think that more than a change in demand, we need to prepare supply in such a way that we have other species which have potential market value, which could also satisfy some trends within the demand.
I'll tell you what, that was such a good question. We're just going to take those first 2 to start with, and I'll open them up to you guys to answer. So first on certification from John, what role does this play, and why are we promoting double certification? Can it help you achieve your legality aims? And then a question here on the training. I thought this is very good. It requires a lot more innovation within the country. So Perhaps we'll start with the certification question.
Okay. It's okay? Yes. Why double certification? ¿Por qué una doble certificación?
Certification, as far as I understand, it's a market instrument. If it's a market tool, there are markets which are more sensitive to this, are better informed. So they have an idea in their minds, and other markets have a different one. FSC is not developed in the same way in all countries in the world. Some countries are more used to one of the schemes than another one. So since it is a market tool, it makes sense to complement these two market tools. Having double certification does not mean a double cost. Many of the requirements for one of the certifications also gives access to the other one. In the audit process, there's also some synergies. The audit of one of the schemes does not cost half of the audit of both schemes jointly. We have negotiated, or companies have negotiated agreements with audit bodies and have also obtained, let's say, good financial agreements in order to carry out this double audit. We cannot also hide the retrospective fear that we had with the intact forest environments. When I got to the association, I had voted in the Vancouver Assembly the 65th motion on intact forests, and I found an association which had absolutely no information and didn't know how to face this challenge. They've had an issue which was fear of how to face this situation. But with the passage of time, these intact forest environments have also, or can also be considered an opportunity in order to sell the certified companies' work to other bodies. I'm sure that that will be so, but we need 3, 4, or 5 years in order to start this process, which could also be voluntary. Why not? For example, the 65th motion suddenly was applicable since 2017-18. It was 3 years after Seville it became applicable, but this has caused big trauma in certified companies. And today we have to be constructed. It could be an opportunity. It could be seen as an opportunity for the future, because there may be companies that could be willing to support certified companies in maintaining conservation areas. However, we have to work very hard at this.
So to me, the very short answer about certification in the training is no. We don't, train on certification. We don't deliberately bring certification or procedures or standards or whatnot in the training.
Okay, moving on, I'm going to move on to the second question, if I can, and I'm going to start with you, Andrew. Some of the training, the speaker was saying, requires a lot of innovation. It wasn't demanding enough or specific enough to those areas. This is something I think should be seen as a big area. What's your experience with the sort of the training programs which do exist, and which I know that GTF is trying to innovate and bring new ones in?
Yeah, I completely agree. There's like anything, there's a range of training available on the market. I think it was linked to the other point you made about the next generation perhaps being the opportunity. And we were in Ghana last week, where they had the launch of a new unified federation that is bringing together a very long tail of associations. And as they were putting together the new representatives, the faces of that group, I think there was, I wouldn't say they were young, but there was certainly a different dynamism in the room for those who will be representing the industry and its needs. And I think some of the support we'll be giving to that new federation and how it sets itself up does reflect the changing nature of the environment they're in and what they need to interact with. And I think if you had written the training 10 years ago, it wouldn't be relevant, it wouldn't necessarily interact. So I think you have to also adapt it for national. You can't just have a training course and roll it out in all the countries you've been delivering it in and the other areas. It has to be applicable to the national situation and in some cases a regional situation. So I think they need to have a certain amount of intelligent design within the training system, to coin a phrase.
And just to add to what Andrew was saying, and the experience in Peru particularly, we have been very successful training young people to deliver and facilitating some of the trainings.
Okay. I'm going to open up for some more questions in just 1 second. I just wanted to ask everybody, or certainly our first two speakers, made the point about China being the influence in tropical countries, particularly across the Congo Basin. In terms of engaging the private sector then, we talked about making training specific to the country, the producer country. Here we've got an unusual situation where you have predominantly Chinese companies acting in Africa. How do we engage with them, and what processes would you like to see put into place in terms of engagement and in terms of communication and training across there? To Benoit, to start with, that's your subject.
So in first place is for these companies to be part of associations so that we can speak to them as a group. In Gabon, there's an association that is IFIAG, that is the Association of Chinese Actors. Its structure, we don't really know it well, but we know they have a president, they have headquarters, and we can start a contact with them. IFIAG, which is a traditional organization in Gabon that is a member of IWPA, has created with IFIAG a network, and then dialogues are starting to take place between IFIAG and IWPA and other organizations. The Chinese man I talked about, whom I met last week in Paris, he was the president of IFIAG. So now they're starting to show interest in talking to us. And many times the difficult is the linguistic barrier, but we're starting to have some interesting conversations with them, especially in light of the latest problems in Gabon. So we will try to get them on board, or they're at least being invited to take part and to co-organize the forum that we are organizing and will take place in October this year. And I think this will strengthen the dialogue with them.
Okay. I'm going to open up the questions here. I'm going to start with the gentleman at the front here, and then we'll come through. Lady at the back and gentleman over here.
Hi, Steve Rhee from the Ford Foundation based in Indonesia. This is actually just to follow on from Benoit's point. Benoit, I was wondering, based on my very limited understanding of sort of the historical relationship between the Chinese government and the sub-Saharan African governments, my understanding that it's been quite strong since World War II, and that the Prime Minister of China will always come to the different sub-Saharan African countries to do a formal visit, which is pretty significant, and that would be done annually, and that many of the PhDs in sub-Saharan Africa were actually funded by the Chinese, and they attended Chinese universities. So that's just to tee up the question. To what extent do you think there's a possible diplomatic kind of conversation that needs to go on between the EU and China, particularly on this question, right? Particularly given if we're talking about the European market. Because it seems to me through the associations, you're only going to get so far. It's really from that diplomatic relationship and agreement there and some sort of collaboration where we can get some actual movement.
Okay, thank you. Lady at the back, just there.
Antoinette Salah, food and farming consultant. I have two questions. The first one is to Norma, and then the second one to Benoit. Can cooperatives own land? Can you just tell us a little bit about land ownership and tenure? Can the cooperatives plant perennial trees or build irrigation infrastructure? And my question to Benoit, can African countries have the luxuries not to deforest when countries are emerging and population is growing?
Okay. Final question was just, gentleman just here in the middle. Just here.
Mi nombre es Juan Francisco Santos.
I'm Juan Francisco Santos from the
y
Association
tengo una pregunta para
of
Benito.
Honduran Foresters, and my question is for
He
Benoit.
estado escuchando estos 2 días acerca de
For
las
the last 2
licencias, de
days,
las
we have been talking
regulaciones,
about licenses
los
and
tratados de
regulations, the different governance agreements,
principalmente en bosques
and
naturales.
mainly in natural
Y
forests.
me gustaría saber
But I would like
si
to know
el sector privado
if the
europeo
private sector in
en algún
Europe
momento tiene algunos
at
programas
some
de
point
fomento
see if
a
they have any kind
establecimiento de
of
plantaciones
programs
nuevas,
for establishing new
principalmente en
plantations
áreas ya degradadas.
in areas that are already
muchas
degraded. That's the question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to leave it with those. Actually, just one more, just up the front.
Hi, Ruth Mallison, Independent. I'm interested, question for the whole panel, but Benoit, in your last slide, I think you mentioned about the potential for cocoa and agroforestry. And my question is, for the panel, is there any, what are the opportunities and constraints in relation to agroforestry helping or basically the opportunities in relation to compliance for timber and also for the commodity sector?
Okay. So just going back through some of the questions, the importance of diplomatic relations in terms of driving change. And I think that's a question for everyone. Question really for Norma about cooperatives and land ownership. Whether the forest is a luxury to think we can keep it standing when there's a growing population. Any programs from the private sector to establish new plantations, and then the points particularly on agroforestry. So we're going to start through here. The importance of diplomatic relations. I don't know who wants to come forward on that one to start with, but Benoit.
Well, I'm not a diplomat, and I don't plan to become one. But there is an experience here. In October last year, in Brussels, it took place the Partnership for the Forest in the Congo Basin, which facilitator is an ex-minister, a Belgian ex-minister. So this is a person of very high level. He was a minister for Belgium. He has a great deal of experience. He's aged 75, I think. And I told him during this encounter, this meeting, I think there were about 600 people there. And I told him that there was a problem. And the problem was that we didn't have Chinese organizations sat at the table with us. And he said, and he said this in front of everyone. He said that the Emerald Princess, she was the host and the president of this negotiation table, and replied that they got in touch with the Chinese embassies in Europe, in Brussels, and they received no reply. They weren't able to get this contact started, and this is an experience. Another point here is that in Europe, we have a mechanism, I can't really remember the name, but I know there is a mechanism that is stagnated at the moment. Well, can you remember the name? Well, maybe you will know the name, but there is a mechanism here, and people from the EU are saying it's stagnant. This discussion mechanism between Europe and China with regards to forest governance, and there is a problem there somewhere, but I don't know how to push this situation forward.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to come in on?
Just on the data, I was just trying to look at who we'd spoken to in China. Just it's not the diplomatic question, but we did speak to 10 associations representing about 4,500 companies. But where they get their raw material from, I don't have that in front of me, so it's not that useful. But there is data, it's on our website, relating to the Chinese companies that we spoke to.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's such a massive subject. I don't think we're going to all answer it in one go. But I'm going to just move on to addressing the question from the lady at the back, starting with Norma about the lady was asking to learn a bit more about cooperatives and land ownership and land tenure, and whether cooperatives are allowed to own the land.
Yes. In Honduras, we have different kinds of tenure. We have private tenure, which is by a person receives a title granted by the INAM, and a public national tenure, of which the ICF, the Honduran Forest Administration, is responsible. And by applying the forest law, the ICF allocates these areas to the organized communities, whether it's organized as cooperatives or in any other kind of way. We also have the different some areas that are under the responsibility of the local councils, the municipal councils. And the cooperatives in these areas are assigned. We have a contract with the state, and it's an usufruct contract, and the state allows us first to carry out any kind of activity that generates sustainability, better living conditions for the community, employment conditions, and also improves the environment, and all the resources are our responsibility. So that's why the cooperatives, we feel that we need to be for our capacity to be developed, so that we are able to comply with these regulations, to be able to carry out our work and to meet the requirements in a transparent fashion, in a responsible manner, but also while creating opportunities to improve the living conditions of our communities. The cooperatives can develop any kind of process that creates sustainability and protects the resources that are our responsibility, and also to create projects, productive projects of any kind. This agreement is an open agreement that allows us to produce any kind of product that will lead to an improvement of our living conditions. The state gives us as communities this right to usufruct and to exploit these resources around us. The forest law and the ICF, via the community forestry strategy, they allocate these areas to us and grant us this right to exploit the resources in these areas. And this is how the ICF, through this strategy, carries out its work in terms of organizing the communities, allocating the areas, but this also gives us certain obligations that we need to draft or come up with a management plan, an operation plan, And in order to do this, to produce these documents, we need financing, a lot of financing that we lack. In some cases, the ICF supports us with management and other organizations, for example, now Clifford and other organizations that are linked to the FAO that have helped some of the communities to draft these documents so that we can move forward with these activities that help us create this income that we need and to do so in a sustainable manner.
Okay, thank you. Just conscious of time, I'm going to move over. I think I can know the answer if we ask whether the forest is a luxury in a growing population, but I'm going to come to that at the end. And just to address this gentleman's point here about whether there were any programs to establish new plantations, whether we knew of plans from the private sector to do some more reinvestments in forestry. I've got to say, from my own point of view, from our organisation, I haven't got any data on that whatsoever. And the companies that we are involved with usually are looking at the lowest risk investment for all of their business activities. And they are moving away from the forestry end into the processing and trading and all of the downstream markets being a lower risk vehicle for investment. But this may be different when you come to different areas of the market. So, Benoit.
With regards to forest investment, the problem is land tenure. There's no security of the investment, and for as long as there's no security of the investment, you're not going to be able to attract private investors in order to create forest plantations. The situation is actually different between the English-speaking and the French-speaking Africa. There's an English company called Miro, which invests in Sierra Leone and in Ghana. I have talked to them to get them to come and invest and bring their experience to Central Africa, but it's not possible until there is some security with regards to land tenure. It's as simple as that. There is lots of opportunities, everything is written from a technical point of view, but there's no investment currently that could come under these conditions.
We put out a report at the end of, I think, end of last year, beginning of this year, which was looking at some of the Central and South American results. And again, yet land tenure is coming up as their #1 issue relating to the plantations, and particularly it was the political instability and the big shifts from left to right, where both were giving control to different people. For long-term big investments, it was slightly disastrous from their point of view. But the shift in raw material from existing plantations has been a dramatic shift over the last 15 years or so anyway. So it is a big part of the raw material. It's just the security in owning those plantations is perhaps lacking.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes, and I'm going to wrap up just with one question that came up particularly in Benoit's presentation, but I know a lot of people were talking about it at coffee and before. There seems to be, we have two processes going on. One in certification, which, as Benoit discussed, was dropping now, depending on the markets which have influence, particularly as the Chinese buyers become more prevalent than the European buyers across Africa, then certification is dropping off slightly or slowing down. Whereas then the secondary process is FLEGT, which is looking at the institutional change, the legal change, and the framework within the country. Do you think that there is a future for both? Do you think that they work together? What hope do you have for both of them? I'm going to start there and work through.
Por supuesto, sí.
Of course, yes. There is a way to complement each other. There could always be players that are happy with just legality, but there may be others that want to go forward, want to go beyond. Of the 5 companies that are FSC certified in the Congo Basin, there are 5 different reasons for them to have obtained certification. The reason is not only financial. So what's important is to understand that the EUTR understands the certification. The certification should be more like a FLEG passport or something that facilitates EUTR. But the certification, I think, is not... it can be also seen with FLEG-TECHT. If we think about Gabon, with a new minister, I think it would probably see an uprise of the certification. I think we should be... I was going to say something positive about certification, but you stopped me 2 slides before I could say something about it. In Gabon, there is the potential for 3 or 4 additional million hectares in Gabon and Congo for the future of certification.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to add, in the context of LACI, however, I think there are complementarities, there are opportunities, but we have to remember that in the context of the U.S. LACI Act, certification is not an equivalent of legality. It can be considered as exercising due care, but it's not an evidence. It's not taken as at face value. So.
Yeah. Andrew, I think they're complementary systems.
Yeah, well, I think you have to step back and look at what they actually have in common. Is they both have similar aims. They would use similar words in what they're trying to achieve in the world. And so, yeah, they have shared ambitions. I think both also exist. So as much as people in this room care about the differences, I think they both exist and can coexist. And FLEGT, where it exists, has social and environmental aspects. It's not just about legality. And equally, the voluntary certifications have other aspects that help all the way through. So they both exist. I don't think it's such a big thing to worry about.
No. Norma, is this an issue at all in Honduras with the FLEG-T?
We see FLEGT as an opportunity that we hope we'll be able to obtain this FLEGT license, because as pine forest owners, we have looked for the opportunities to get certified with the FSC, but we have not been able to comply with the requirements that FSC had. The requirements, they're very high, very demanding from what we can comply, and we've not been able to. It became a high cost for us that we were not able to recover. So we now see that the FLEGT VPA scheme is an opportunity for us to comply with the requirements, because we will be complying with the laws that we already have. They're not demanding new legislation compliance or new conditions. That's why we see FLEGT VPA as an opportunity, because we cannot comply with FSC. We found that impossible. In Honduras, there are some organizations that have managed to certify their forest. Some private owners, in their case, it's called private property because they have a title that can guarantee. In the case of plantations, they can guarantee the land tenure. It is theirs. No one can take it away from them. In our case, we have problems. We have tenure-related problems because the regularization is not clear. But we hope that the FLEGT VPA system can open up this opportunity for communities.
And it will recognize those better. Okay, well, look, we are slightly over time. So if you do have other questions, I'm sure you can collar people over lunch. But in the meantime, thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you.